You fathead. You'd be surprised what it was. Oh, I'm on the air. It's all right. So don't you see these little girls there? It's all part of the window dressing. We won't be on for another half hour. Ted Malley is still giving his weather. So just be calm out there. You know, since we are here now at the Limelight, are we all at the Limelight, gang? Let's hear it. Yay! What a hole! Yay! And it's in the heart of sizzling, live, dynamic, honest, clear, clean-cut Greenwich Village, where the search for truth goes on endlessly. Right, gang? Yeah. We're searching for the truth tonight, eh? Yeah, I can hear that. You notice how they chickened out when you said the truth? There's a little fear. You know, have you ever had the feeling that you take the average person, especially men, I don't know about women, but I can tell you, the average man, he's walking down Fifth Avenue or he's walking down the main street in Trenton, just walking along, you know. You put your hand on his shoulder and say, okay, buddy, it's all over. He'd say, all right. I'm serious. I'm sure that the average guy always waits for the heavy hand on his shoulder. And when you use the word truth, he always thinks it's in connection with somebody else's rottenness. But you look a guy right in the eye and say, the truth is going to come out one day. And then what? Well, I'm going to tell you what. For the past 2 weeks, I have been living with the Beatles, or as they would call it, the Beatles. And I've been in Dundee, Scotland. I've been in Edinburgh. I've been in London where they work, Leeds, Liverpool. I've been in all these various cities on a whole series of one-night stands with the Beatles, living with them, living in their room with them, in their dressing room, riding through the dark countryside, trying to escape the fanatics, and observing England from the other side of the glass. Now, we're all Americans here, and the one thing that Americans are used to, they're used to constantly being under the scrutiny of other people. For example, Beyond the Fringe comes to New York, and it's a satire by Britishers, mostly about America. And we sit out there and applaud, you know, and somehow it seems right that Peter Cook should tell us what's wrong with Congress, you know. Somehow Peter Cook knows all of the things that are happening in the American presidential election and so on, but it never works the other way. I suppose you're aware that if I were to appear in Britain, they would not immediately nominate me to play Richard the Lionhearted. And yet, are you aware that they're casting a movie here in America, and they've just recently cast a man to play Abraham Lincoln? Guess what nationality he is? We're going to have a British Abraham Lincoln. And somehow, you know, that makes him more official, you know? I mean, the idea that Laurence Olivier or somebody like that is playing Lincoln seems a lot more real than if, say, an American were to play Lincoln. Because, you know, there's a little thing there. Well, being a good American, of course, I have been completely awash in Britain ever since I was a kid. We take English literature in school. We go to drama. We study English poets, English history. In fact, most of us know more about English history than we do American history. And so now I find myself in England, in the real thing, sitting in a little tiny, superheated, stinking, smelling dressing room, knee-deep in fish and chips and beer with the Beatles. England's final answer to Richard the Lionhearted. You know, it's a weird thing. And out in the darkness, I can hear the sound of millions of girls screaming. It's a children-girl thing, you know, in England. And you hear, it sounds like 1,000 sirens going off in the distance. It's just a high-pitched wail. It goes, whee! Goes in waves, whee! And then one of the Beatles says to another Beatle, I think it was George, said to Paul, he said, Paul, you're a Beatle. And Paul says, aye. And George says, Paul, you're a Beatle. Pass a miracle. Walk on water. Walk on water. And Paul says, okay. And he goes to the window, sticks his head out with the hair, you know, wow! The whole world explodes. He throws it back again, and he turns back to me, and he says, are you Beatle people? I said, no. He said, well, then sit down and have a beer. Well, I'll tell you that the sense of unreality, I think that these people feel, nothing is real out there anymore. And they have to drive at night at 3 o'clock in the morning through secret roads that are guarded by police so that people will not attack out of the bushes. And at night, when you're sitting in the back seat of the car and the Beatles are hiding down on the floor at 3 o'clock in the morning, going God knows where, being protected from God knows what, you begin to have a slight realization of what mankind is about. And you don't really quite like it. And at the same time, you can't help it because you're part of it. It's like being in the Army. Any of you in the Army in this crowd? Well, you know the sense of being in the Army, and you've got a uniform on. You're walking around like other people, and yet you're not part of it. I wonder whether or not anyone has ever recorded that one facet of Army life, that when you're in the Army, the other people are totally unreal. The civilians. They seem to be another race. And that's the way it is with the Beatles. Today, the world is like Mars to the Beatles. They're the only real thing, just 4 of them sitting there, eating a steak, drinking a beer, and it's all brought to them. You know, they're never allowed to walk on the street like normal people. They're never allowed to even look out of the window because riots. How would you like that fantastic sense of power that if all you had to do was go to the window and say, kill each other, boom, boom, the knives would come out. That's exactly what they do, and they do it often, you know. Once in a while, Paul will sit there, you know, and they get a little bored, and they're all sitting around in their T-shirts. And outside, you can hear the rest of the acts going, you know. You can hear the rock and roll roaring around. And suddenly, Lennon, or maybe Paul, will get up. You like a little excitement? And Ringo says, That's Ringo's total vocabulary, incidentally. He's not one of the brighter people. But he's sweet, girls, all right. I wish I could tell you the real stories of the Beatles. And Ringo goes, And then Paul goes up. Usually he goes up to the window. He says, watch this. I'll try to do the Liverpudlian accent. He says, oh, watch this. He walks to the window, and he has maybe a potato chip. Anything that's just an ordinary little piece of nothing, a cigar butt, you know. He's got a paper cup. He said, watch this. He looks out the window, and he just peeks out a little bit. You know, they have drawn shades, and everybody is out there. The whole city of Glasgow is out there. Millions of them. And just 5 minutes before, you know, you have an idea of the kind of madness this thing is, because we're sitting in this tiny little dressing room, sweaty, hot, showbiz. These are rock and roll performers, you know, and they're very simple, very earthy, basic people. They're just like showbiz people everywhere. They don't read. You know, they just sit there, see? And there's a little knock on the door, just like this. Now, I want to show you a scene. Little knock on the door, and one of them looks up and says, who's there? And the door opens just a crack, and it's one of their managers. And he says, excuse me, Paul. The Lord Mayor of Glasgow is here. The Lord Mayor. Ringo turns to Paul, pops his ear. John goes, spits. And then somebody says, let him in. And the little Lord Mayor comes in. Remember, this is the Lord Mayor of the city of Glasgow. He comes in with his hat in his hand. He says, "Are you the Beatles?" And they say, "Aye, we're the Beatles. Who are you?" He says, "I'm the Lord Mayor of Glasgow." "Ah, politician, eh?" "Yes, yes." "We got to get back to work." He says, "Thank you for letting me in." And the door closes. Now, what kind of madness is this? I observed this. And then we are in Dundee. Now, Dundee is a Scottish town on the coast of Scotland, and it's hard and rough. It's a fisherman's town. And in fact, I'm not in town 5 minutes, and I'm walking past this little tiny store, and the window is filled with knives. Millions of tough, rough-looking knives. And I'm curious, you know, it doesn't impress me as the J.D. sort of town, you know. It looked like 42nd Street. But these are real big, bone-handled knives, you know, the real stickers, real toad stickers, you know. And so I go into this place, I figure I'm going to get myself a real souvenir this time, you know. Something that I can use back home. See, I'm in radio, friends, you know. And so I go into this joint, and here's this little lady standing back, a little Scottish lady, and I go into the store, and her little daughter or something is with her, and they are totally unused to seeing Americans. Americans do not come to Dundee, especially in the off-season. And especially they don't come to a little second-rate, what appears to be an Army-Navy store, where they had a collection of old maces from old crusades, you know, left over. That's the way with the British Isles, you know. You can buy some great surplus there. So I walk in, and I'm standing there, and their Scottish dialect is so almost totally unintelligible. And I said to her, "What are the knives out in the window? I'd like to look at some knives." And she says, "Sure, those knives are for killing sharks." I said, "For what?" "For killing sharks. The fishermen here use them for sharks." I said, "The fishermen use them for sharks?" I mean, this is not like Jones Beach, you know. And so I bought myself a knife, and I walked out with this fantastic knife, great big toad sticker. And it came with a leather sheath. So I'm very little embarrassed by this thing. What do you do with it? You walk down the street, and they didn't wrap it, you know. They don't hardly wrap anything in England. I've got a big knife. And walking down the street, and I didn't go 20 feet, and a man came right at me wearing high rubber boots, and he had a toad sticker that went down to his kneecap. Just walk, clunk, clunk, clunk. He walks past me. Great big Scottish shark fishermen. They fish for shark livers there. And you could smell him a mile. He walks past, you know, my eyes clouded up. And he... By the way, I'd love to show you how. I just wish we weren't on the air. I've been working on it. I will entertain my friends with this, but you ought to hear a Scotsman swearing. It is, honest to God, it sounds like a fantastic symphony. I have never seen creative swearing like you hear a Scotsman. And I sat in the back of a Scottish taxi cab in Glasgow, which is one of the toughest cities in the Western world. And we were going through the side streets of Glasgow, and this guy kept up a steady stream of stuff. At first, I thought he had bad tappets. I thought his valve springs were bad. He just swore steadily. And it's all in Scottish, and somehow, when it comes out with those rolling R's and that, it sounds cute. You know, we go right down the mainstream, right down the mainstream of traffic, and I become aware of a sullen undertone of the same thing going on. And that's the way you drive a cab in that town. I don't think they use gas. Just what a tough city. So now you've got an idea of what Dundee is like. It's rough, tough, you see. And I am there with the Beatles. The Beatles are playing this little theater. There's about 3,000 seats in it, and it's bigger than the town, you know. And the Beatles have arrived, and the fishermen are coming in. Big guys with boots and funny hats on with the knives and stuff. They're clomping in. And now we're in the dressing room in Dundee, Scotland. It's a very strange thing for an American to get inside of life. Most of us, Americans, are rarely admitted to this kind of a world. And the Beatles were sitting in their dressing room, waiting for their dinner. And out, just where the sea began, you could hear millions of Scottish kids screaming. Just a steady beat. You could just hear it coming in, and the rain was coming down, and you could hear the toad stickers clanking out there. Oh, it was a strange, surrealistic world, and I just wondered what it was all about. You know, have you ever had these moments when everything seems so unreal that if you were to walk across the room and to float 6 inches right off over the carpet, it wouldn't surprise you, you know? I couldn't put anything together. I had only been out of America about 3 days, and now I'm in the back room of a ramshackle old theater in Dundee, Scotland. And you could smell oatmeal. You know, the Scots live on oatmeal. You could smell oatmeal, and they drink Scotch whiskey. They really do drink it. And when you walk through the streets, you can smell it everywhere. You're stepping over, you know, all the time. Well, they do. They really put it away. And the Beatles are sitting there, and they're passing it around in paper cups. We're in Scotland. I'm trying to get my bearings, and there's a knock at the door. Now, get this scene. This is the Beatles in Dundee, Scotland. This is an ancient part of the British Empire. There's a knock at the door, and one of the Beatles says, "Who is there?" And I hear another little knock, and it's their secret knock, which says, "It's okay, open up." And so Lennon goes over, and he takes the door, and he just sort of peeks out, and there is one of their managers, and he says, "A countess is here." And Lennon turns to the other Beatles, and he says, "A countess." And Ringo says, "Let her in. Let's take a look at her." I says, "A countess coming to see this, you know?" And sure enough, the door opens, and in came this magnificent, she really looked exactly the way you think a regal countess should look. She's dressed in furs. She's tall, thin. She has a peculiar kind of ring she wore. She just sort of held her hand this way. And she walked in, and behind her were two ladies in waiting and a tiny little chauffeur wearing little black hats and black puttees, you know, like those in the, you know. And I'm standing there, you know, watching this. My God, I had the terrible feeling of being an eavesdropper on something I shouldn't have seen, you know. And the Countess comes in, and here are the Beatles, all with their shirts off. One is sitting there picking his toes, his shoe is off. I'm telling you the truth. I'm not inventing it. They're all sitting, and not one of them gets up. You know, they're all sitting like this. And the Countess comes in, her furs trailing behind her, and you could just hear the sound of these medieval trumpets rising, you know. It was the British Empire. She walks in and stands in the middle of the room. Nobody said a word. Until finally Paul said, "I hear you're a countess." She says, "Yes, I am a countess." "Yes, yes. Are you the Beatles?" And Ringo belts John in the short ribs and says, "Get this, are we the Beatles? Is she putting you on?" You know, their hair all hanging there. "Are you the Beatles?" It's like asking, "Are you Santa Claus?" You know, the big beard. You know. And so one of them finally, you know, I said, "Well, when are they going to ask her to sit down or something?" You know, and here they are. They're shoving potato chips in their mouth. You know, one's eating the potato. One guy's got a piece of fish hanging out. Like the scotch, they're belting it out. And she finally says, she says, "We have driven all the way over from the castle to see you. And I'm so delighted that you've allowed us to come backstage. I love your work." Ringo says, "Huh?" And she says, "Yes, we play your records at the castle all the time." And somehow I had that, suddenly I could hear it. Rock and roll, booming out through the castle. You know? You just don't want to think of England, do you? You don't want to see C. Aubrey Smith and Laurence Olivier digging Presley, walking around spitting and yelling. Well, finally, there was a long pregnant pause, and Lennon, who is the most civilized of the Beatles, suddenly he comes to and he says, sit down, Countess, sit down. And she sits down. Have you ever seen a countess sit? She really did, and all the Beatles are looking at her. So she sits down, and her furs go down like this, and she's got a ring. She sits and looks, and she says, "Which Beatle are you?" And the Beatle in question says, "George, like in King." So help me, I heard it. And she goes, yes. How funny. And then Lennon says to her, he says, "Are you a real countess?" She says, "Yes, I am." And then Paul says, "Where's the count?" She says, "Well, he didn't come tonight." And we waited for a moment. It was one of those great moments of classical human behavior. It sort of hung there for a second. And then Lennon said to her, he says, "What kind of castle do you live in?" She says, "Well, it's a very big one. It's called Glamis Castle." Yes. Glamis Castle, in case you don't know, is the oldest of all the great castles in England. And she's talking to 4 Englishmen, remember that? And one of them says, "Glamis, where's that?" Even I knew, And she says, "Well, it's you turn left at the road down at the end, and you turn at Route 7, and you just continue on. You can't miss it, It's a big castle." And McCartney says, "How many rooms does it have?" And so help me, she turns to her lady-in-waiting and says, "Oh, Lady Barbara, that would be in your department. How many do we have?" And Lady Barbara sat for a second. She says, "I believe 238. And Paul says, "You've got plenty of room for your relatives, haven't you?" And she says, "Yes, we have a lot of room." And Lennon then comes back with a question, by the way, that is a pure American question. When was it built? Only Americans ask this. And Lennon said, "How old is it?" She said, I believe it was started in 1067. 1067, and I'm listening to this fantastic story of the British Empire unfolding right out there before me. And the Countess finally said, you could see she was the master of all difficult situations. This is the thing that sets the aristocracy apart and above us. And she didn't know how to end the conversation. And she finally said, she says, "You'll have to come and visit me. Why don't all of you come to the castle?" And Paul said, "Hey, that ain't a bad idea. We're staying in a damn motel tonight." And you can see automatically, the poor Countess can see 4 drunken Beatles arriving at 4 in the morning yelling with 8 million fans in Glamis Castle. And she says, "That would be lovely. Now, may I have your autographs?" And one after the other, Paul, George, Ringo. And that's the end of it. And she walks to the door, and the Beatles, not once getting up, fish and chips, their gin going, slugging away their scotch. She gets to the door, and one of them says, "Oh, Countess, have you eaten? Would you like something to eat?" She says, "It looks very good." And out she went to the sound of more trumpets. Well, I sat there, and I thought, for crying out loud, I'm an American. I shouldn't have seen this. Somehow it didn't seem right that I should see a thing like this. That, was she slumming or were the Beatles slumming? It was very hard to tell. She went out, walked down the hallway, and Paul said to John, he said, you guys, that's a real countess. And John says, yes, I've seen countesses before. They always wear coats like that. And Ringo goes, And that was the total discussion of the Countess and her life. Now, the next night, I thought, this is a fluke. And so the big concert went on, and the people screamed and yelled, and it was almost like a kind of fever in the air. It was like the bubonic plague. It was very hard to it's hard to describe it to you. It's as if the entire country has decided it's going out of its skull. And they have appointed the Beatles to be the reason. And the Beatles, now they don't even sing anymore. They just go out on the stage, and woo, it starts, and they wave a little bit, and then they go off. And the roaring continues for hours. So about 2 hours later, I'm in the back seat of the Beatles' car, and we're heading for the Scottish Highlands. Have any of you ever been in the Highlands? It's a very interesting experience. These hills climb all the way to the sky, and the country is probably the most beautiful in the world, next to Switzerland, and possibly even Switzerland included. You can't believe it. And it's at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and we are screaming down a highway at 95 miles an hour in a gigantic Austin Princess, which is about the size of let's say a super deluxe Rolls. They've got it floored, and we're screaming through this little country road, taking corners on one wheel, just woo, and I'm sitting in the back with the Beatles, I said, what's the matter? What are you doing here, Shepherd? What is this? And they're all sitting back there changing clothes. Do you know that their clothes zip on? Are you aware that those little skinny suits they wear, that you can't put them on? And that their pants zip all the way up the back. They have a guy that zips them all up, and they walk out. They stand like this. That's why, have you noticed the Beatles don't move much when they're on stage? They don't make any Elvis movements or anything. They just sort of stand there, like little dolls, they wave. They got springs and everything. They're all zipped up, and the curtain goes down. It's wild. The curtain goes down. They all turn to the right, and a guy rushes out, and he goes, ooh, 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 ooh. Then they walk. The Beatles. Oh, what an insane time. So I'm riding through this countryside with them. I can't believe it, I says, this is England. This is what we in America all have a vague sense of inferiority about. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, the road was lined with dour-looking people, just looking out from behind haystacks, waiting for the Beatles to go by. 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and you could see them holding lanterns up, and we're sailing through the countryside, and every car that they saw, they would throw rocks at. This is a form of love in Scotland, by the way. And you'd see the rocks bouncing across the street, and the people said, get down there, here we come, watch the one by the haystack. Watch that nut. And you boom, boing, you hear the rocks. And I'm sitting there and says, oh, what would King Arthur have thought, How would he have handled it? Well, we went deeper and deeper into the countryside until we finally arrived at the lock where we were staying. The Beatles, in case you're interested, there are more security regulations governing the places where the Beatles stay than that which governs the president. Seriously. That people are sworn to secrecy all over the countryside, and wherever they stay, they always stay outside of town in the most likely place. The most likely place for anything but Beatles. Like they'll stay in a little place that's marked diner. They just stay there overnight. Or they'll be in a little place marked motel, and they'll stay there. Well, we were staying in a tiny inn next to an ancient Scottish loch, Loch Earn. which is one of the most ancient and most revered. And in fact, Bonnie Prince Charlie had fought a battle 20 feet away from where I was staying. That little plaque out there. Rob Roy had robbed somebody 20 feet outside the other way. Yes, I'm serious. And everywhere you saw this strange tartan quality of the world, because this is really Scotland. We arrived about 3 o'clock in the morning, and the innkeeper is there. You can see that this is the greatest moment of his entire life. He had been knighted. He had been designated. It was like a visitation. It was like a second coming or something happening there. And he stood by the door, sort of bent over, tugging at his forelock. Are the Beatles there? And I said, yes, they're going to be. He said, are you with them? And I says, yes, I'm one of the party. He says, may I shake your hand? Put her there. I'm one of the Beatle party, you know. Somehow that made me it made me part of this whole scene. And the Beatles slowly straggled up the hill in darkness, and one after the other, they came in through the door, and a couple of managers arrived out and back in their little cars. And we went into the bar. I want to give you a typical vignette in the Beatle world that you never hear about. The strange world of the... I can only say that this is the world of... I guess the word would be almost delirium. It's like the world has become delirious. It's surrealistic. Remember, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. We're next to a Scottish loch. An old loch with hills surrounding it. There's not a sound for miles. It's a sullen, quiet, angry countryside. And all of us go up to the bar. Little tiny bar in the inn. Paul, John Lennon, George, Ringo, the manager. And he brings out a bottle of sherry. This apparently was a bottle of sherry he'd saved since the last coronation. And he was saving it for the next one. He brings out the sherry, and he says, would you like a glass of sherry? John says, sherry? What sherry? Who drinks sherry, man? He says, what will you have? I have anything you want. He's got scotch. He's got all the fine stuff there. Each one of us was poured a little drink. We started to sip the drink when, without warning, there was a sound outside in the darkness, a hum, like the hum of angry bees at 3 o'clock in the morning. And it was getting closer and closer. You could just hear it. It was coming like a big storm. And the Beatles are doing nothing. They're just sort of standing. And I said to the man behind the desk, I said, what is this, a storm? He says, I don't know what that sound is. It must be something on the road. And just when he got this out of his mouth, the door slams open, and there stands a Scottish constable. And he says, are the Beatles staying here? And the man behind the bar says, yes, sir, yes, sir. He says, I have just called out all available men. There are 20,000 people coming this way. What are you going to do about it? What have you done to us? And the Beatles calmly, just drinking their scotch. And that night, we spent in total darkness with a ring of policemen in the hills. 500 policemen keeping the entire British Isles away. And you could hear the hum of them out there. You could hear them in the trees. You could hear them in the hills. And once in a while, you'd hear a little wave of, ah! Just, wow! And it would trail off. And it's now 3:30, 3:45, and a couple of the very famous local gentry had been allowed to come and see the Beatles at first hand. One of these strange little vignettes. A tall, thin girl, obviously the sweet Beatle fan type, you know. She comes over and she stands behind one of the Beatles. She's just been admitted to see them. She can't believe it, you know, because they're not real to people anymore. They're kind of like dolls or strange little automatons. And here they are. There's sitting there. And she walks over behind and she just sort of looks down. And by mistake, she brushed one of the Beatles' coat. And he whirled on her and he says, "Get your filthy hands off me." Well, he wasn't being funny. And she sort of ducked back. He says, "Nobody touches me after midnight." She says, "Yes, yes." And then there was a kind of an embarrassed pause, and the Beatles kept eating. And finally she said, "May I have your autographs?" And one of the other Beatles looked up at her and says, "Will you clear out?" And she says, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And out the door she went. And the Beatles sat in total control of their world. They would either admit people or they would deny them. They would either give them an audience or they would turn them down. And believe it or not, it got to the point with me, you know. I'll tell you, there's a funny thing in human beings where I began to feel special myself because they talked to me. Yes, this is the kind of nuttiness that must have created a Hitler. Must have felt good to a guy, you know, to walk in and have Mr. Hitler say, "Oh, hello, hey, there goes Hans. Hi, Hans." How many of you would like to be greeted by first name by, say, Lucky Luciano? No, it's a secret thing. We all have a secret desire to somehow be greeted on a first name basis by somebody who is a real myth and a legend. And up to this point, you know, I had been a non-believer. And I saw this happening. Nobody got angry at the Beatles. Oh, no. When the Beatles would throw somebody out like the Countess, just hurl her out in the street, it was all earned. And she felt pleased to have spoken with them for a moment. And so it got to the point where I would come in, and John would look up and say, "How are you doing, Gene?" I would glow. The Beatles recognized me, you know? And when one of them would say to me, "How would you like a drink, huh? Here, have a drink." And he'd hand me the drink. The great warmth would come out again. And I realized that I had been admitted to Olympus. I was allowed to be on the same plane with a world phenomenon. Fascinating. And I kept trying to say, don't worry. I kept trying to say to myself later, I'd get out of the room. You know, I was over there on a special assignment to do a piece for a major magazine on the Beatles. And I would get out of the room, you know, and they've talked to me. We've sat and had drinks and stuff, and I would get out into the privacy of a hotel aisle or a hotel hallway, and I'm walking along, and all of a sudden I says, "What are you doing? This is a rock and roll group. These are the Beatles. For God's sake, Shepard, get a grip on yourself." And then the door would open down there, and McCartney would stick his head out and he'd say, "Hey, Gene, when you come back, knock twice. We'll let you in. We don't want to let anybody else. Just knock twice." And he'd slam the door, and then I'd say, "I know what I'm doing. God recognizes me." Well, you know, I learned something then. I learned how possible it must be for a reporter to remain objective in the presence of the very great. Notoriety can be greatness, you know. I remember one day down in the Yankee bullpen before a ball game, one of the hard-hitting, angry writers from the Post, you know, the Post works in anger, you know, like other people work in clay and marble, you know, really bugged. They look at the Yankees as a plot against the Mets, you know. And one of these hard-hitting, angry reporters, you know, almost all of the really angry writers are very undersized little guys with thick glasses. It's what makes it come out, you know. And I'm standing back down there, way out by the bullpen, you know, where the Yankees have the bullpen way out in the corner there. You expect to see nobody out there. Well, standing right next to the bullpen wire fence is Roger Maris. He's just standing there. He's been chasing fly balls. And you know how Maris stands anyway. He's got that snotty way of standing, you know, just that real loose way, you know. One hip is flung out, you know. He's got his hat, that straight-on hat. He's got the mitt there. And Maris is just surveying his entire kingdom. You know, from out around that bullpen, you can see all of Yankee Stadium. You can see the press box. You can see 80,000 people. You can see those 3 tombstones over here. And Roger is he's in his milieu. And he really is the king of it. So I am standing out there. I don't say anything. I'm an observer. I make it a rule of thumb is to keep your mouth shut unless spoken to. I found this works very well. So I'm out there, sort of walking past. I'm seeing Raj. Raj is standing there with that big number 9 on his back. He's wearing the home uniform. He spits. And I see this little New York Post writer come scurrying around the edge of the path. Little man, you know, he comes up, you know. Hi, Raj. Raj looks down. Hi, Ray. I've invented a name. He just says, hi, Ray. That little guy straightened up. You could see his gut pull in. Raj is doing nothing. He's watching the flags, you know. He doesn't even know. He's just waiting for his time at bat, you know, in the cage. And the little man says to him, how does it look today, Raj? Do you think we'll do it today? Do you think we'll do it today? Do you think we'll do it? And Raj just simply says, I don't know, Whitey's going. It's pretty good. The little guy says, that's what I thought. Looks good. He scurries away, and the next day, I read this piece in the Post, and it's a hard-hitting expose of why they should trade Roger Maris. And I thought, gee, you know, so much of this is that problem of objectivity. Have you ever thought how it must be to travel around the country in a presidential train where you're really with the president, and the president comes in every 5 minutes after giving one of these whistle-stop speeches and sits down next to you, eats a sandwich, drinks a beer maybe, or has a glass of milk, begins to know you, begins to know that your name is Myrtle, this is old Ray here, and there's Fred. How can you possibly keep your objectivity? I know many a good drama critic who is totally ruined that day that Olivier begins to call him Bert. Forget it. It's never going to happen again. Never be able to observe the scene with that old cold light of objectivity. And as I rode throughout that countryside, I found myself slowly becoming not only a Beatle fan, but a Beatle. Yes, I began to, you know, when the screams were out there, they were screaming for me. You know, I was sitting in the crowd with them. I was part of it, you know, they were me. And I'd walk to the window. You know, one thing about Beatle fans, they scream at anything that moves. You got to understand that anything that moves, they scream at. And even if it doesn't move, if they think it's moving, they scream. And so one of the band boys, one of the kids who worked in the Edinburgh Theater, all he did was set up the drums, you know, that kind of jazz. He came backstage, and there's this little window looking out over the alley where there are 18 million kids screaming for the Beatles. And he was talking to one of the Beatles about setting up the equipment. You know, just a straight conversation. Like, what do you want it? Do you want it back over there or over here? And one of the Beatles says, don't worry about it, man. I'll adjust it myself. He said, okay. And then he turned and walked to the window. Just stood there for a minute, and then pulled the curtain back and looked out. And there's a fantastic, Wah! He pulls it back. He turns back to the crowd and he says, just once I wanted him to scream for me. Just once. Now that sounds like I invented it, but so help me, that's exactly what happened. He says, just once I wanted him to scream for me. Which brings up a point. How many of you secretly scream for whatever it is you scream for, whether it's a presidential candidate, whether it's a philosophy, whether it's a Beatle? How many of you scream? How many of us scream just out of the sheer exuberance of screaming for something. Just screaming for anything. Anything that somehow will respond to our screams, like bow a little bit. Yeah. I have a feeling that one day, in some of our major countries, there will be mechanical devices which will be set up to receive and record the quality and the quantity of screams that we can hurl at. And that we will have favorite machines. Somebody will like the green one. Somebody will like the red one. Somebody will like the blue one. And every night they will put another one of these on stage for us to go scream at. Now, hear that? Whose watch? Strange. But it's a curious thing to sit backstage in with the Beatles and see the kind of madness they engender. Do you know that when the Beatles are on stage, not one person listens? Are you aware of that? And a good 25 to 30 minutes before the Beatles come out, the thing starts. Their screaming starts. And they don't sit, of course. They all stand. And have you ever seen paintings by Hieronymus Bosch? Well, I stood on the stage. Let me tell you, the wildest scene of all is not to watch the Beatles. But I stood on the stage, apron, just back of the curtain where you could see out and they couldn't see you, and I watched the audience. And whoever was staging this, I'm telling you, it was a fantastic job of staging. They had red lights playing over the audience. Just back and forth, red and green spotlights, up into the balcony, and over here into the loges, and the bottom here into the theater pit. And this entire mass of screaming, waving, insane, wild human beings, you couldn't even relate to it as human beings. It was like you were looking at some kind of swarm of beetles or gnats or some kind of an insane wasp nest that's been stirred up. And then the final night happened. It had to happen. Even the Beatles themselves had never seen anything like this. We were playing a town called Leeds. Now, Leeds is an industrial city, just an ordinary kind of place. It's like Gary, Indiana, as a matter of fact, or like Union City. You know, there's a lot of factories and refineries. Sort of a tough, nothing city in England, an ancient one, but very nothing. And nobody was expecting what happened. It just came out of the combustion. The Beatles were on stage, and the waves were coming up, screaming, just roaring up, one after the other, and it was getting higher and higher. And the man standing next to me was their road manager. He'd heard thousands of these, and he said to me, he says, "This doesn't sound right. This doesn't sound right." And he called two of the stagehands. He says, "Get over back here. Something is going to happen." He said, "It sounds funny." And sure enough, it did. It was getting more and more. It was coming in wave after wave and quicker. And suddenly, without any warning, it was like a big wave coming right out of the ocean. It broke right over the parapet, and there were about 50 girls on stage. Just went boom. And the Beatles, they staggered back, their little zippers popping, And the Beatles, by the way, are all about 4'3", And this great wave of girls all poured up on the stage, and it was a fantastic melee, and the stagehands, constables, and me, by the way, we all rushed out, and big scream for us, part of the show. And what do you think the girls were doing? It was unbelievable. The girls were tearing off their clothes, not the Beatles, but theirs. Literally tearing their clothes off on the stage. There must have been 50 of them. Well, here they are throwing these chicks back like footballs into the crowd, and they were all about 8 years old, 9 years old. You grab one and whoop, her bloomers are flying, and the rest of the crowd goes, "Wow!" And we're throwing them back. One of them had crawled under the stage. How she got under, nobody knows, under the stage, and she came out of the wings like a shotgun shot. Just boom! She hit out there like a little bowling ball. She rolled 3 times and knocked Ringo's drums over. And as she rolled, you could see her peeling, just wildly peeling. Ringo grabbed her by the neck and pushed her down. Get away from me! And she let go a fantastic... Ah! And Ringo says, pull the curtain down, man! And boom, down it came. And the Beatles were trapped with 7 naked 5-year-olds. What a moment, I'll tell you. A great moment in the English theater. I'll tell you, they're throwing the kids off the bow. And, of course, that ended the show for that night. And the next day, the press blamed the Beatles. The press said the Beatles, once again, have caused violence to strike our small city here. And I'm thinking of all those parents at home with little girls named Agatha. You know, little skinny girls eating oatmeal. And the mother says, did you enjoy the Beatles last night? Yes, Mommy. And I can only see a picture of little Agatha flying through the air, trailing her pants behind. No, I suspect, you know, and I began to have a real understanding of what this is all about. It has nothing to do with rock and roll. And I'm curious, and you know, the Beatles often talk about this. In fact, the Beatle manager, a couple of them, this is a subject that always comes up, is, I wonder what the next act is going to be like. Well, already they're beginning to pop out. There's one in England that comes out on the stage, and there are 4 guys, and they wear their hair down to their waist. And it's all in a bouffant hairdo that goes trailing on down. Have you ever heard of that group? They wear pink sweaters, and they wear these tight stretch pants that girls wear. You know, these little things that girls wear, and they come out with high heels. Oh, yeah, I'm serious. I'm not exaggerating. They're the biggest new thing in England. Now, I can't tell you what the audience does with that crew, because we have women and children listening to us. But I saw them work in London, and you cannot believe it. First of all, their audience isn't really little girls. It's something else. Well, in a manner of speaking, they're not little girls. It's a very difficult thing, this culture business, you know. And when you get over and you get close to the underbelly of all this that's going on, you wonder just really in what direction. The third day I was there, Pravda came out with an editorial, and they had a picture of a riot that had occurred in one of the English cities over the Beatles, and it translated said, another example of Western decadence. And everybody says, oh, what is this stuff? You know, what? And I thought, well, is it or isn't it? Are they telling the truth or are they not? Let me tell you of the night. Do you want to hear about the nightclub that I went into? It's the innest, hippest English nightclub. And the number one guest that night was Mandy Rice Davies. Oh, yeah, she was the number one exhibit that night, and I sat down next to this girl. It was a dark place, and the rock and roll is coming out. And it's wild. It's just a scene like twisting, writhing bodies. And the music is just booming out. And I'm an American, you know, we're used to, you know, the limelight, how innocent, you know. I come in there and I sit down, look around, and the guy next to me says, would you like to meet Christine Keeler? I says, the Christine? Drapes and a toga and you're in business. Oh, yeah, you know, decadence. I think that one, oh, hey, we're on the air again. Come on, let's give Ohio a big hand, crowd. Hey, listen, you just don't know how it feels to have to live in Circleville. You people just go through. I mean, you know, some guys never leave Canton, Ohio. No wonder they think New York is a plot against them, which it really is in a way, you know. But speaking of plots, we're back here at the Limelight in the hearty, reliable Greenwich Village. A Fleischmann's yeast cake of passion here. And yes, it's fermenting. I can feel it. We'll be here until about midnight or so. And if you're casting around for a cheapy place, we're here. You know, speaking of cheapy places, one of the great things about traveling, I mean really traveling. By traveling, I mean getting out of the tourist rut, really traveling, is it does the same thing to the traveler that being in the Army does to the soldier. It gives you a sense of anonymity and a sense of irresponsibility. I'm curious how many people who are very hip back here in the States who would never think of taking a picture of a statue in Central Park. All of a sudden, their basic slobism comes out in London. They just walk around, you know. You can be a slob. Nobody can see, you know. Even if you're a Village Voice writer, you can be a real slob in Greece, you know. Nobody's going to see you there, you know. And of course, it holds in all kinds of areas. Now, back home, I don't go to nightclubs. It just doesn't interest me much. Well, I'm in London. I'm there about the second or third day. And one of the Beatles says to me, he says, have you ever been to the Whoopee Club? Well, I'm giving it a name. It's a different name, by the way, than this. So this is an artificial name I've given it. So I says, no. He says, well, man, if you want to really see something, go to the Whoopee Club with me. I said, fine, all right. And so that night, long after everything had been put away, are you aware that in New York City, now wait, I'm going to let you in on something, people, that right here in New York City, there are little cells of inness, little places where the really in people, and they're allowed in because they are in, you know. I don't know how to express it. It's just, they're in, you know. These are the people who go through life and never pay for anything. The whole world is on an expense account as far as they're concerned. They even charge dying to the Diners Club when they die. They deduct it. These are people who never pay for a blessed thing in their lives, and they're the true ins. You might call them the borderline celebrities. In fact, they're even more celebrities than celebrities because, you know, a real celebrity has to do something. An actor has to work and be an actor to become a celebrity. He's a working man, in short. A painter has to paint to be in. But there is a special kind of celebrity who is above all of that sort of thing. And they're truly in. And all over the city of New York, there are these little rooms, little dark rooms. They're called this club and they're called that club. They're never mentioned in columns, by the way. They're that in. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, you have these little gatherings. You know, all those people that appear on the Johnny Carson show. And you sit in there, yeah, all the official people, you know. Oh, yeah, it's great. You know, you can't believe it. Zsa Zsa Gabor, they're all there, you know. And so when you get into one of these places, you're actually admitted. You feel like somehow that there is something in this business of heaven. That some people are admitted to some things and others aren't. And that we're all always before the great bar of justice. Now, the beautiful thing about most people is that they're not even aware that there is an in. These are the true out, you know. They're just... They're all looking at me dumbly like I'm inventing this, you see. This is the great lumpen proletariat. And the guys that are in have the most fantastic disdain for that lumpen proletariat out there, that great population made of cream of wheat. You know, the people that they run over with their Alfa Romeos, you know, that kind of, you know. Oh, yeah, I'm serious. There is a real aristocracy in this world, and they have the complete disdain for those out there. And that includes everything morally, you see. That the morality that the lumpen proletariat abides and lives by, that is a sign of outness, literally. And that the more you behave in the accepted pattern of behavior, the less likely you are to ever be admitted in. Now, I suspect that if Nero was around, Nero would have 5 of these little establishments going. They, as a matter of fact, have existed all through history. All through history. And usually, most of the people in a civilization are totally unaware of this. It's just they don't even know that it's there. And yet these people are a kind of leader. Because after you've been to a few of them, you recognize that what is going on in here is what will be going on out there 5 years from now. But what will be going on in here then is unimaginable. Totally unimaginable. And so one of the Beatles says, why don't you come to the Whoopee Club? And I says, the Whoopee Club? And he says, the Whoopee Club. And I, immediately I think of something like with girls dancing, and cigarettes and all that stuff, the hat check girl, and, the whole bit, see. I'm really a lumpen proletariat. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't, on the radio yet, on the John Gambling station. Gee. So I said, yeah, I'm sure, I'll go there. And he says, wait, this is quite a thing, So that night, the show is over. We finish our work. The Beatles have finished making $8 million. I have finished observing them. Everything is settling back now to a normal thing. And of course, in a city like London, a Beatle can get around with comparative ease because, it's a fantastically big city and all the men have got their hair like this. So, it's just another one of the goops, that's all. And so we are sitting in the back seat of a cab, me and this Beatle. We're going, we go up and down little side streets, and I figure, where are we going? What is the side? Because I keep thinking in terms of, the Great White Way, Broadway, the Copa, and all, the Latin Quarter. And he says, the Whoopee Club. And when he said the Whoopee Club to the guy who was driving the cab, I noticed a very peculiar thing. The cab driver gave a sudden quick look back. He says, aye. And he sort of scrunched down. He didn't know who he was with, and he wasn't taking any chances. He just knew about the Whoopee Club, that's all, It's legendary, so I didn't know it until, years after a week, but I saw immediately. So up and down the side streets we go. London streets at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning have a certain mausoleum quality about it. It's a very spooky city. To me, London is the most foreign of all cities. I say this to you as an American, because you're constantly under the impression you can talk their language. You're always under the illusion of contact, and it never quite works, and you wonder why. You keep feeling that everything is a little out of focus, and you're always on the verge of a fist fight. And either they're going to hit you, you sense there's a certain stretching of the muscles there, or else you feel like, well, what do you mean? You want to go down and grab him. You don't get that feeling in Holland, because in Holland they just go, you go, yeah. And then you pay, Everything's fine, no problem. It just works out great, and wherever you go like that. But in England, you know what I'm doing to this day now? It's funny, when you walk around England, and everything in the windows, there's prices on it. It always says 310 6D, or some little funny thing like that. And you automatically divide everything you see, or multiply it by 3, or divide by 3, or something. And you look there and you say, oh, that's $7. That's not bad. $7 for a Rolls Royce. and and you walk in there, and it turns, you can't quite figure out. Now I'll walk around, and I'm looking in the Bond clothing store, and I'm translating it into pounds to figure out whether I'm getting taken or not. So you get this funny sense of the enigmatic in England. It's a very enigmatic country. You have the feeling that they're sweeping an awful lot of stuff under the carpets, but you can't find the carpet. You just have this sense like you'll meet some very important man, like he's the head of the God department. You meet him, see, and he's Sir Malcolm something, and you sit down with him, and you note that his collar is dirty. You know, this is a little, and not only dirty, it's very worn around the back. And you don't know what to say, you know, and whether he's a Slav. And he speaks in this beautiful Oxonian, fantastic language, and all the while he keeps spilling soup on his pants. Very peculiar, you know, you're always trying to put it in focus. And all the while he is saying, of course, you know, this is the one thing about the Americans, they're certainly such bores. You don't quite know what to say, you know. Where does boorishness stop and a bad set of false teeth begin? Well, I'm walking through the streets, and finally we get to this corner, and he stops the car. And it looks like a closed block of office buildings. You know, it's like if somebody at 3 in the morning took you down to Wall Street. Everything's closed. There's nothing on the streets at all. Darkness. Boy, when those London streets go, when they turn them off, man, it's like somebody has turned off a switch somewhere, and everything is off. The sound is off. They've turned the sky off. The clouds have been turned off, and everything. There's a kind of a fog settling in, see. And you can hear things echoing. And my little Beatle friend, you know, his turtleneck all pulled up, he's walking ahead of me like this. You know, I'm sort of running behind him. So I figure as long as I'm sticking with the Beatle, it's all right. You know, at least we can hear, oh, I'm a Beatle, and the town will turn on, you know. So I'm running behind this guy, and we get to a doorway in the side of a building. He opens it up, and there's a light in there. I go in with him. And at the other end of the corridor is one of these automatic elevators going up into what appears to be BBD&O. I mean, serious, it looks exactly like an office building. You know, the kind up here in Manhattan, you know, with all about 25 stainless steel elevators that says sign in and all that stuff. And here's an old man sitting there, and I walk in and say, what is the scene? You know? He says, "Y'all follow me." And the little man says, "All right, will you please sign in?" So the Beatle writes down Beatle. And so I don't know whether to write down my real name or the name I always use when I'm traveling, Charles Follinsby Apperson. Never know, you know. So I write C.L. Apperson, and he says, all right. We stand there, presses the button, you know, the one that says up. He presses, wait. Little red light goes on, the doors, and I am standing in a stainless steel elevator with a Beatle. Doors close, we stand. This is the damnedest night out I've ever had. You know, I'm waiting for the whoopee sounds. I'm waiting for the sounds of a cigarette girl or somebody grabbing my coat and wanting a buck or something, you know. We get up to the top of this building. We go about maybe 5 or 6 stories. Just goes zzz, and it goes unk. Opens like that. We step out into total, absolute Stygian darkness. Complete. I mean, it's like there isn't a light in 1,000 miles. And there's a man just sitting there on a 3-legged stool watching. Just looks at us. He is there, you see, to keep the outs out. Once in a while, one arrives, you know, with a bucket and wants to sweep up or something, you know, and they just throw him out. So he just looks at it, and he immediately sees it's a Beatle. And he goes, hey. And he says, Beatle. And he says, okay. So we go in through another doorway, and we're now in. Well, how can I describe it to you? Is there any Dante fan house here? I am serious. I am in a scene of unmitigated profligacy. It is passion unbridled in the darkness. And from loudspeakers all the way around the walls, you hear this just deafening sound of rock and roll. It's just going dunga 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 dunga, and I'm jumping, you know, like this, and this Beatle just walks ahead like that. And you hear in the crowd, I Beatle. He says, I. And back we go, all the way through this room, and the writhing bodies, twisting and screaming, the hoopla and the uproar, and one after the other, you could see people peeling off. And finally, the Beatle says, sit down here. And I sit. Well, I immediately recognized that this was not a meeting of Little Orphan Annie's secret circle. That my magic decoder pin was not going to decode this. There were a lot of messages that didn't have anything to do with me going on. And sitting directly in front of me is a chick. See? Well, you know, I'm Charlie Apperson. See, I figure I can make the scene pretty good here now. You know how Americans are. We're all in this, so I'm going to be part of it. And there's a chick sitting in front of me there. The darkness is getting darker. And they bring me a drink of some strange elixir. You know that the inn people don't drink stuff like you're drinking. I don't know what they made it out of, but I had 3 eyes instantly. They used some strange Mexican root, which is so esoteric and so evil that they haven't even yet made laws to keep it out. They don't want to... They don't even want the... There is such a thing. And they mix it with Coke. So they shove one of these in my hands, and my eyes are immediately adjusting. I got 3 eyes moving around like this, you know, searchlights, my ears are singing. And I see this chick ahead of me, and I belt her between the shoulder blades. I say, "Hi, baby." Well, the chick turns around and gives me a look of sheer, solid hatred and turns back to the crowd. I said, "Well, take another slug of this strange drink. Passion is flowing through my veins like a deep, rich river now. This compost heap of live emotions, me, is beginning to pulsate." I say, "Hey, baby!" And she turns to me and says, "Excuse me. My name is Chuck." Well, now, wait a minute. Are you applauding Chuck? Or the fantastic boo-boo I made? So I said, "Oh, hi, Chuck." Sit there, you know. And I reckon, and here is Chuck sitting ahead of me there, and he's talking to a real chick. And they're discussing their hairdresser. Well, I sat there for about 3 minutes trying to get my bearings. You know, have you ever had this feeling of being suddenly thrown into a dark swimming pool and you don't know which way you're going? It's like waking up at 3 in the morning, you don't know you know that feeling of waking up at 3 in the morning in bed and you don't know which way you're turned? You can't figure out which way is the bathroom, you know, or anything. So you're laying there, you're lying out. Say, "What do I do this way?" You know, you're looking around. You know, you're lying. And here you're actually lying right, you know. You wake up and you turn out, what happened? Well, this is the sense I was having in the Whoopee Club. I didn't know what to say to anybody because I didn't know what the language was. But all I knew was that I was definitely a spy. I was from the outside world, and they didn't quite know it yet because I had come in with a Beatle. Well, I sat for about 20 minutes trying to get my bearings. And all the seats were low. You know these seats that you see in Roman orgies? They're just low, long, flat things around the wall. Not real seats. So if you want to sit on somebody or put your feet on somebody's ears or anything, you know, just everybody's all lying around like this, you know, on each other and all tangled, a twisted mass. And somebody kept pulling my leg, trying to get me into it, you know. It's just all out there in front of me, just twisting and turning like so. And I stayed there for about 10 minutes on the edge of this thing, and they're tugging at my feet and hitting at me. And finally, the Beatle comes up for air. He surfaces briefly. And he says, "Hi, Gene, why don't you get in and join the fun?" What do you do? It's just come in. It's all right, the water's warm. Well, I plunged in. Now, I want to tell you what happened. I literally did. I plunged right into the darkness. I stepped out of the little circle. They had little tiny lights where you could see the seats. And I stepped into the arena. And from ceiling, they had ceiling speakers. Oh, fantastic. About the size of those great big squares up there. Over the entire assemblage. It was a pit. Sort of hung down inside. And over the assemblage were these loudspeakers not more than 1.5 feet over your head, turned up 1,000 dBs above S9, rock and roll. Physically, you want to just pounding you, boom, boom, boom. It's going, you hear the sound of Beatles screaming, and I get down in the middle of this mess, and they're twisting in the darkness. I can just see this wild thing, so I go off into it, I start twisting. I move it back. They're not dancing, remember that. They're not, I shouldn't use the term twist because you think in terms of dancing. It was just a strange gyration that everybody was doing in the darkness. They'd bump into each other and they'd move off. Once in a while you'd step on somebody, they'd squish and they'd move off. You could hear squeals of laughter, out of the dark. Whee! Whoopee! And I had a feeling this was only the prelude. I had a sense that this was the opening movement of this party, whatever it is. And we went round and round, and then suddenly they turned off the PA. Just boom, like that. This is a signal for everybody to go back and have more gentian root. Or sassafras tea, or whatever that stuff was, which they sold for 5 pounds a clip. And so I go staggering back, and I sit down there, and immediately out of the darkness, they're handing these things out again. I've got another one, you see, and the first one is now turning my feet to stone. You know that funny feeling of you're beginning to fall asleep from the foot up, and it's working its way up to my knees now, you see? And the top of my head, I can hear little things going ding, 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 little bells ringing. Well, I take one sip of this, and I know I had better get out there on that dark street quick. Because one more sip, and Shepard ain't coming home. I knew that I would not be on the air anymore, and pulled into that maw of human debauchery, never to return. In fact, they tell me that there are many American celebrities that you know people. Have you often said to yourself, I wonder what happened to Charlie Brown? He's out there in the darkness somewhere. It's insane, and you come away. Speaking of insanity and passion pits, what station is this, friends? Come on, let's hear it. Yes, the John what station? Hey, let's give the Westport School announcements a big hand. Right, George. Well, I was kind of stunned for a minute, and I sipped a little bit of my drink. And sitting next to me was Mandy Rice Davies. I'm telling you, so help me, I'm raising my hand. It was Mandy Rice Davies. Now, what do you say to Mandy Rice Davies? Do you say, I've admired your work? Like I've been a fan for years. She's sitting right there, she has this beautiful English, strange kind of Cockney accent. And I said, I'm an American. She says, yes, I know. Apparently Americans are no fun in that department. And so there was a kind of a cool moment there, and I said, nice club. What do you say? And she just turned to me with a stone cold look, and it swept through the crowd. An outsider was in. I knew it. The Beatle came back and sat next to me, and he said, how you enjoying the club? And just as he said that, the music started again, and they melted into the darkness, and I was alone. I watched for about 2 minutes this moiling mass in the darkness, the screams and the yelling, the great roar of rock and roll, and the giggles. And you could hear the sound of grapes being stepped on. Somewhere a violin was being played. Nero was on the scene. You expected to see any minute guys with cloven hoofs running through. Little horns, with fur pants on. Well, this went on for about 5 minutes, and I knew I had to go because it was going to be a stain on my soul I could never erase. And I walked to the door, And standing in the doorway was the guy. You know, you don't pay when you go in, you pay when you go out. Apparently, there's a lot of people who are holdovers in there. This is... If you want to come, you can stay 2 weeks, you know, if you want to. And I walk up to him, and he says, are you a member? And I said, I'm with the Beatles. I said, you're coming back tomorrow, huh, are you? I said, yes. And I go into that little stainless steel elevator all by myself. The doors close. Silence. You know that hermetically sealed feeling you get in these automatic elevators? And as I went down, every foot I went down, it became less real. It stopped. It went zoop. And there I am in the lobby. There's a little old man sitting there with he says, sign out, please. So I go over and I write 416. My shaky hand, and it's all swirling around me. My eyes are still bulging, and my feet are still that numb feeling they're asleep. I get back out on the street, and there's a single girl. I'm going to tell you a wild scene. This is exactly what happened. There's a tall, thin, beautiful girl standing under the street light. Now, you really see people in England at 4 in the morning. They really stand out, and she's standing under the street light. I came back out. Boy, the air. It's silent. Back of me is an office building that looks as innocent as Young and Rubicam does tonight. It does, you know. It's just a solid office building with the stainless steel front. And the girl comes, and I thought, uh-oh. Don't tell me this now on top of everything else, you know. She comes up, and she says, excuse me, please. Were you in the Whoopee Club? I thought, uh-oh, am I going to get busted? I mean, is this fuzz or what? You know, that instant feeling, fuzz. And I said, yes. She said, would you please take me in? I said, take you into the Whoopee Club? She says, yes, I've heard about it. I've heard that it's so much fun. And I said, well, I'm not a member. I was just taken in as a guest. She says, oh, you're so lucky. You're so lucky. I said, yeah, I guess so. George, you know, I began to feel like a real debauched, rotten person. I'd been to hell and back, you know. I walk out, I hail a cab, and I get in the back of the cab, and we went about 5 blocks, and the guy turns to me, and he says, were you at the Whoopee Club? I says, yeah. Yeah. What are you going to make of it? He says, I had Mandy Rice Davies in my cab. I said, ah, you're a lucky man. He says, yeah. And we rode through the quiet, still darkness of London, past Buckingham Palace, past those great ancient eating clubs, and finally back to my little pad. And I wondered about what side of England this is. What part of it is. Who is in the darkness out there? You know, right now, at this very moment, right here in America, right here, I'd say within about 3 miles of where we are, I would say that there are maybe anywhere from 2 to 5 cells just like that going on. Would you like to go, gang? Crazy. Would you like an invitation? No. Well, you know they don't. You, uh-oh. You notice her husband doesn't say anything.